Today we will talk about the amazing work that Endeavor Brazil is doing, and particularly we will be speaking with Pamella Gonçalves, who is the Research and Public Policy Manager at Endeavor Brazil. We spoke the other day, and I was very impressed by the work that they're doing, and I think that they have very valuable insights that they can share with the rest of Latin America. So, Pamella, it's great to have you here today.
Hello, Ignacio. Thank you very much.
What is Endeavor? Let's start with the basics. Many people don't know what Endeavor is. Most people in the ecosystem know, but I think it's good to go over it again.
Perfect. Endeavor is an organization that supports high-impact entrepreneurship around the world. So today we're in over 20 countries, mainly focused on developing countries, and we support these entrepreneurs. So we try to find local cases that have a lot of potential to grow and to become examples to inspire lots of people to actually start their own companies. We say that more than actually we don't provide them money. What we do is we provide them with a network of people and mentors that will actually help them throughout their growth stage. So our big aim is to try to have a portfolio of very big, inspiring examples of successful entrepreneurs around the world.
Fantastic. And tell me a little bit about Endeavor Brazil specifically. How long has Endeavor been in Brazil, and what lines of impact are you trying to, or what lines of action are you pursuing?
Okay, perfect. Endeavor Brazil was founded in the year 2000 here in the country. It was brought over by some very successful entrepreneurs in Brazil that until today are part of our board. And since then, our main objective over here was actually similar to the international model, was trying to find these successful showcases here in Brazil that could inspire lots of people and show people that actually starting up a company was an opportunity. Because what we saw in the past here in Brazil was actually that most people would start building up their own companies as their own need. It wasn't an opportunity, but it was a lack of opportunity in the market to actually get a job. So traditionally, what we had in the country were lots of entrepreneurs with very little innovation and people with low education. So what we the move that we've seen in the country over the last 10 years was actually trying to show people and qualified people that entrepreneurship is an opportunity for their growth as professionals. So we started back then in year 2000 working a lot focused in the culture. We used to say that when we came over to Brazil, entrepreneurship wasn't even a term in Brazil. You didn't have such a word in the dictionary. So our big first conquer was in 2004 when the dictionary actually called us up and asked us for a definition on entrepreneurship, and we finally included the word in the Portuguese vocabulary. And since then, we've actually seen a very big switch in terms of culture. Nowadays, entrepreneurship is quite well seen in the country. Lots of students in universities consider opening up their own company, and a lot of the traditional view of like the entrepreneur as eventually even a villain in soap operas has actually turned into the good guy that is actually promoting impact and social development for the country. So for us, looking at the Brazilian soap opera is a reflection of what the culture has changed in the last 14 years.
But at the same time, you're doing things that are really extraordinary, and you're pushing the envelope beyond what we've seen in the region.
What we understood was that we couldn't only inspire people to actually start up their own companies. We had two big challenges in Brazil. The first was an issue in education. So we hardly heard anything about entrepreneurial education, and we knew it was extremely important for people to be successful in their endeavors. So we started working with education about 5 years ago. The first attempt was bringing methodology from Kaufman Foundation, and it was a fast track course where we actually brought it up to Brazil, try to adapt it to the Brazilian standards into Portuguese, bringing cases from Brazilian entrepreneurs and taking that to universities. So we actually trained teachers in universities to give classes of entrepreneurship in universities. Today we've got over 16,000 students actually having courses on entrepreneurship on the methodology we brought to the country. But our attempt, we understood that the velocity of things in universities wasn't the speed we actually wished for them. And we also knew that lots of the entrepreneurs in Brazil weren't in universities anymore. So we had to go over and get a bigger range of people that weren't necessarily students. So what we actually we also invested a lot on our website. And about 4 years ago, we actually transformed our website that was basically an institutional website with information about Endeavor. We actually transformed that into a portal where you can find a lot of content on entrepreneurship. So we have articles, we have toolkits for entrepreneurs, we have courses, short-term courses where you can actually sign up and watch videos on specific subjects. So we're taking a lot of content to Brazilian people. Today we have approximately, I think, 2.5 million unique visitors assessing our website, and our aim is to try to get to 7 million in about 2 years. So that's been a very big strategy because we knew we were never going to be able to have high impact entrepreneurs if we didn't actually look into education and the educational system in the country. So that's been one big change, and I think that was a change in terms of the Endeavor traditional model, and that has been quite successful. Other endeavors around the world are actually looking into this too and trying to understand how they can also take that to their local governments and work together with the educational system in their own countries. And then the third and most recent initiative is the initiative that I actually lead. When we came over to Brazil, our dream was always to try to influence public policy, but we knew it was a huge challenge because we had very little data on entrepreneurship in the country. So we started about 4 years ago with a partnership with IBGE, that is the local statistics agency that calculates national GDP and lots of other data on the country. We partnered up with them, and we started producing a national statistics report on entrepreneurship. So that's been going for 4 years now. And more than just looking at entrepreneurship in a broad way, we try to classify and look into a specific category that are the high impact entrepreneurs. So these guys that grow over 20% a year for at least 3 years, and that doing that generated a lot of jobs. So I think one of the main data that came out of all this report, and that actually was very useful for us, was one of the numbers that shows that in Brazil we have about 35,000 high impact entrepreneurs and high growth entrepreneurs. That represents less than 1% of the companies. And these guys, between 2009 and 2012, were responsible for, if I'm not mistaken, almost 60% of the jobs created in Brazil throughout this period. So that was about 3.3 million jobs. So that was quite impressive. And once we saw these figures, we were straight at the government and we knocked on their door and we're like, hey, we're not talking about a very small group of entrepreneurs. Yes, they are small in terms of size today, but they actually represent a lot for the economy. And these guys are really, really important. And since then, the government has actually tried to look for us and asked us for help in specific programs. So now Brazil is launching programs to try to accelerate companies and try to bring similar models to Startup Chile and other that have been launching worldwide. And they've actually they've actually started consulting Endeavor to understand what had to be done to actually promote not only startups, but start helping these companies to grow That has always been our focus over here. So today, we don't only do research. Our main objective is having data, providing data to support the public policy initiatives. And so a lot of talking to governments and taking all this information and helping the public sector to take more, take smarter decisions and understanding really the context in terms of ecosystem so that they can actually take the correct decisions.
Amazing work that you're doing. I mean, thinking that only 15 years ago the word entrepreneurship didn't exist, and today you have over 2.5 million people accessing your portal, and the government very active in this is really, really amazing. Tell me, many people will probably see this in Latin America. Today I was speaking with somebody in Colombia who said they will listen to this. So what would you recommend to them and to local governments and to national governments in terms of what actions they could take around data collection in order to get a better picture of how the entrepreneurs ecosystem is evolving and what kind of impact it is having on employment, etc.? What kind of metrics are you collecting right now, and how do you go about them?
We actually look at the ecosystem in quite a broad range, perspective. We've studied quite a lot of international reports, specifically the Entrepreneurship Indicators Program of OEDC, to understand. It provides a framework to try to address and measure entrepreneurship. There are other examples. UNCTAD's been developing other frameworks. We try to keep it to what already exists. There are lots of people studying entrepreneurship for quite a long time. What we have done is eventually small adjustments to understand Brazilian context, and specifically, we don't only look at Brazil nationally, we look also at cities here in Brazil, because we know that a lot of public policy is done on a city level. So we've tried to separate what actually is the influence of the federal government and what actually is the regional government's obligation, or eventually in his area of action. So we look at 6 to 8 pillars. So the regulatory framework, we look at market, we look at infrastructure, that in some frameworks is actually inside market. We tend to take it out because in Brazil we see that it is very relevant and that it can change a lot from one area to another. We look at access to capital, we look at innovation, we look at another pillar called support to entrepreneurship, where we actually look at organizations that provide support to entrepreneurs directly. We look at eventually courses specifically focused on entrepreneurship. So it's a mixture of entrepreneurial capability with the network and support, mentoring if people are actually willing to cooperate with entrepreneurs, if big companies are willing to cooperate with entrepreneurs. So that is sort of a support system. Then we look at human capital, so people, because we know that people are essential for these companies to grow. And by last, we look at the culture. So understanding if people actually favor entrepreneurship, if entrepreneurship is well seen in terms of media, and how is the portrayal of entrepreneurs around the country.
Once you have these pillars, how many metrics do you collect for the whole perspective? And how many of these metrics had to be generated together with the IBGE to get a high precision picture of what is going on?
We're about to launch right now, I think in about 1 month's time, probably around the 21st of November. We're about to launch a study where we actually bring a framework with about 50 indicators for these 8 pillars, considering entrepreneurship around the country. So we get 14 14 capital cities in the country. They're not all of them, but they're most of them. And we actually bring in some indicators and metrics to try to measure the ecosystem regionally. It all depends. So if you look at these international frameworks, you have a lot of suggestions of indicators. What we've tried to do here is try to keep to national data as much as possible, because we do have a couple of reports that we produce internally, but we know that whenever we try to talk to the government, it has another weight when you say that the data is not produced by Endeavor, but it's actually the government's own data. So our first step is always trying to get maximum of data that the own government produces. And that's the reason why, right in the beginning, we started with a partnership with IBGE, that is the National Statistics Agency in the country, and for public policy. So I think that was the first step. For us, we use the most of local data we can use, national data we can use. We do have an issue, specifically, for instance, in culture. There is no government data produced on entrepreneurship culture in the country. So we have already produced a couple of reports trying to measure the culture around Brazil. In other areas that we had a little bit more challenge were areas in trying to measure the support system is something that can also be quite tricky. In this report that we're going to launch on the 21st, we've actually taken out part of this support. We didn't give it a main pillar in the analysis, because we thought that we had some data that was actually quite fragile. In other areas that we had some challenges in the regulatory framework recently, we try to measure not only the time to open up companies, but the time it took in terms of bureaucracy in the country. That is being it has been a very important issue that's being quite a lot discussed now through election process and everything. So what we did was we partnered up with a company that provides services for companies to get all of their licenses and everything organized. So they're constantly talking to the government in all different cities and going up to try to get some licenses to open up companies, or to get approved some kind of reforms or anything that the company eventually needs to do that requires permission of the government. So what we did was we partnered up with them. They have a huge capillarity. They're in most cities in the country, and we started measuring with them the number of days it took for these companies to receive the approvals on the documents that were submitted. So that is quite a nice kind of set of data. I think it's going to be quite challenging when we launch it public, because no one's ever seen this information in the country, and we're definitely going to have a lot of debate over them. But it's an area that we're actually thinking might be very, very interested in. Lots of companies might be interested in this information. And then I think the other area that we had some challenge was when we're trying to get access to capital. We have the part that focuses on debt, and debt is quite easy. You have national data on debt, but we don't have a lot of information on venture capital, private equity, and angel investments in the country. So that was another area where we actually had to partner up with a fund of funds to try to produce data on all the operations that have occurred in the country over the last couple of years. If I'm not mistaken, our analysis takes the last 5 years into consideration, but it's something quite new. You don't have official information on, and we gathered that up in order to produce a good evaluation of the country.
What countries would you highlight as best practices or as interesting benchmarks and cases for study for Latin American countries, and why?
The definition of the benchmark depends a lot on the actual situation of the country and the main leads. So what we try to always do is first a very good diagnosis. and based on that diagnosis, understand what would be the best benchmarks. So a lot has been said, for instance, of Startup Chile. And for us, it's a great example in terms of culture, when you actually try to focus and take people to discuss entrepreneurship in the country. We don't think that necessarily that's the main challenge in Brazil right now. For us, one example that we started investigating and that we are interested in looking into a little further is the case of Medellin. Because Medellin has just recently won the prize and being recognized as one of the cities that most innovative cities, and that is one of the issues that we think Brazil has a huge challenge in. We have an entrepreneurship culture. People look towards entrepreneurship, but we have a huge challenge because the size of our market in some ways acts as sort of a buffer. That entrepreneurs don't necessarily look internationally and try to produce the most innovative business model or the best product team, because he doesn't necessarily need to in order to be successful in Brazil. So one of the challenges we look into a lot is this issue of innovation, and we've been looking at the work that has been done over the last 20, 30 years in Medellin, actually trying to build up a community focused on innovation and partnership between companies. So I think that's a very nice case. For us, obviously, I think Silicon Valley has a lot to teach in terms of attracting very qualified people. That is also an issue in Brazil. We actually tend to export most of our talents instead of bringing them over. And I think Silicon Valley has a lot of this variety in terms of culture that Brazil can have and has a lot of potential, because we don't have a specific, lots of people say that Brazilians don't have a specific face. It's a mixture, depends where you go. Up north, you've got some kind of profile. Down south, you've got other people. So we have a lot of diversity, but we don't actually know to play that in our advantage when we talk about starting up a company and building up a company. So I think we have a lot to learn on how Silicon Valley promotes this high qualified, attracts high qualified people and promotes this exchange in terms of diversity. For us, even we look at, for instance, Argentina, and we compare Endeavor Brazil with, for instance, Endeavor Argentina, and we see that entrepreneurs in Argentina, for example, they're a lot more, you've got a tech industry that is very strong down there, and they're a lot focused on going international. That is something that Brazilian entrepreneurs also, as I just mentioned, are not necessarily looking into. So I think there's definitely something in terms of culture over there that we can learn
What
with.
about in Europe or other emerging countries like Singapore, Hong Kong, Israel? Have you been studying those cases?
I've been studying a little bit less these cases. I know Singapore has a very interesting work, even in terms of public policy, the regulatory framework and the work they've been doing over there to try to help entrepreneurs and companies to grow. That is very interesting, and I think Brazil can learn a lot with. I've also had some contact recently with the UK, and I've seen UK focus a lot in terms of innovation, also trying to bring countries and trying to become sort of the hub of Europe when you talk about expanding companies, and especially innovative companies. So we've been talking quite a lot to the UK, and they're quite interested in understanding a little bit more of our companies and taking these over there. Like, you can open up a company in one day, which seems very, very challenging for, very distant for most of the Brazilian people. So what we have seen in Europe and in Asia is that the government has provided a lot of support in attracting entrepreneurs to these regions and actually helping them presenting them potential clients, easing up the burdens in terms of bureaucracy and even tax system in some cases. So I think there are lots of nice examples. Part of what we've been discussing with the government over here is that we have to help them. That I think the government's the part the government has to play is not necessarily provide incentives all the time. Because if you provide only incentives for people, you might attract the wrong profile of entrepreneurs, so you can't give them benefits. What you do have to do, however, is ease their life so they don't have to focus their time and their energy and actually having to solve bureaucracy and solve problems that the government puts in front of them. That is a lot what we see here. So you don't actually have to give them money, just get some burdens out of their way and ease the way so that they can do their own job and focus their energy on their companies and not on the government and not on bureaucracy. We believe a lot in this idea because if you just provide, becoming an entrepreneur is not something easy. If you provide people with a lot of money, lots of people are going to eventually go into entrepreneurship and start up their own companies without good ideas, not necessarily solving problems that people really have, like real problems of the world, and they'll eventually have, they'll eventually not work in terms of their companies will eventually break, or they'll eventually not be successful throughout this entrepreneurial path. So more than actually trying to provide incentives and get people starting up companies, it tends to be more effective in actually reducing burdens for people that have already started and that have potential to make these guys grow. So what we've seen here in Brazil is, and that we've been discussing quite a lot now, is we have a simplified tax system for small companies. That is one of the, we have, I think, one of the biggest programs in terms of tax incentive and facilitation for these small companies around the country. And the result of that is that today, probably around 80% of the companies are in this special tax regime, and they don't want to grow. And we think that's terrible in terms of economy, because what we do need is we need companies growing, because these guys that actually try to grow will create more jobs and will add more value. So part of what we're discussing with the government now is we don't need to give more benefit to more people or expand that benefit, but we have to create a transition process that actually helps companies to grow. Instead of just looking at the small and protecting the small against absolutely everything. Because we know that becoming an entrepreneur is quite tough and competition is huge worldwide. So the government doesn't need to protect these small guys. What they have to do is actually helping them, strengthen them, and help them to grow.
What is the profile of the high-impact entrepreneurs that you've been supporting in Endeavor? And what are the programs that have been helping them the most, and the challenges that they have? You mentioned some of them, but I think that it would be interesting to give an overall view for people who don't know Brazil and are interested in getting sort of an introduction, a brief introduction, 5 minutes, around the high-impact entrepreneurship ecosystem.
I think above all is a lot of passion and a will to actually change things, because if it is tough to become an entrepreneur around the world, I think it's even tougher to become an entrepreneur in Brazil. So if you look at international index and studies, we're often quite back behind in terms of reports and ease of doing business. So I think it's particularly difficult to become an entrepreneur here in the country. And that's why a lot of passion is extremely, extremely, extremely important. What we've also seen is a lot of this, the entrepreneur profile, he has to be a guy that looks a lot into teams and building up teams and trying to attract the best people to work with him. Quite often we've seen companies reach around 30 million reais, or 20 to 30 million dollars in revenues, and it's really tough for the entrepreneur that is a lonely guy carrying his company all by himself to overcome this barrier. So what we've actually seen of these high growth entrepreneurs is they've focused a lot of time in actually building a really, really strong team. When we talk to investors here in the country, we see that a lot of them also invest in companies, not necessarily because of the business plan itself, but because of the entrepreneurs and the teams that are behind this project. And I'm tired of hearing them say, oh, if this project doesn't work out, I'm sure they're going to be able to make a new project and start up from clean. So I think a lot of energy has to be put into building a strong team and attracting people to help you out throughout your growth and your dream. We believe a lot here at Endeavor also in the power of mentorship. We know entrepreneurs don't have a lot of time to actually sit in a classroom and actually dedicate time to studying, traditional formal study way, but we believe a lot in actually learning with others. And it's funny over here, quite often I go speak to people are starting up their project, and they're like, hey Pamela, can I tell you a little bit of my idea, because I want to start up a company and I want your feedback on it. And people here in Brazil are still quite suspicious of others when they're actually talking about their project. They're afraid you're going to steal their idea or try to rob it, and that's a lot of what we've tried to break in terms of culture here. We think it's very important to tell people, because you probably can receive a lot of feedback and learn a lot with the mistakes others have already committed. And what we've seen in these entrepreneurs that today we support and that are high impact entrepreneurs is they're not afraid of actually learning with others and opening up their fragilities and what are their main challenges. They're quite open-minded, and they hear a lot of feedback from people to help them out. So at Endeavor, our whole model is based on this idea of mentoring and learning with others. And what I've seen is that most entrepreneurs, they say here that to be an entrepreneur can be quite lonely, because you're usually at the top of your company trying to take very tough decisions, and usually decisions that you've never took in your life. So being able to actually share your decision and hear from others that eventually have already gone through that is very, very valuable.
Amazing work, and I think it's very inspiring work for the rest of the region. I wouldn't be surprised if people in Medellin are studying your case. As a matter of fact, I'm quite sure that they will be, and I'll be happy to connect you if you like. I totally agree with you. I think that Medellin has a very interesting story to tell, particularly in the spirit in which they developed their city. I think that is something that we need throughout Latin America. So we're going to be doing a series of interviews about that. But I mean, I'd be happy to connect you. I think that the more bridges we have, the better we'll be. So thank you so much for sharing all this information. I think that it will be very enlightening for many people in Spanish-speaking Latin America, and I think that it's really great that you're doing this, all of this work.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for the opportunity. It's been very good, and I'm available. I hope to help whoever needs. Again, our basic is, I think there's a lot in comparing and learning with others, so we're here open to do so.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.